Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the Southwest Quadrant Virtual Preparedness Town Hall. We're going to get started in just a minute. We're just waiting for a few more folks to join us. All right, I think we're ready to get started. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us, like I said, for the Southwest Quadrant Virtual Preparedness Town Hall. I'm Haley Randall, the Program Assistant for the Zoo and Aquarium All Hazards Partnership. Before we begin, we're just going to go through a few quick logistical reminders. All participants have been muted upon entry, and we ask that you remain muted throughout the informational portion of the webinar. During the interactive components in the breakout sessions, you will have the ability to unmute yourself, and we welcome you to do that. We invite you to participate through the chat feature if needed. And if you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, please feel free to send a chat to me, and I will do my best to assist you. You will see that a live transcription has been enabled for this webinar. To disable this feature or to view the full transcript in a separate window or change the settings, just click the caret next to live transcription at the bottom of your screen. Presentation portions of this webinar will be recorded. Interactive components and breakout sessions will not be recorded. I will be available to assist you throughout the webinar and during breakout rooms. So if you need any help, please message me and I will do my best to help you. And I will now turn it over to Dr. Yvonne Nadler, Senior Veterinary Advisor for the Zoo and Aquarium All Hazards Partnership, to kick us off.
Great. Thanks, Haley. I have the pleasure today of introducing Mr. Marshall Wilson. He is with the Department of Agriculture for the fine state of New Mexico, and he also is the voting member of NASEP, which is the National Alliance of State Animal and Agricultural Emergency Programs. And NASEP is a really interesting group. It's composed of a lot of state employees that whose responsibility it is to manage animals in disaster. So that is that NASEP member is also another sort of stakeholder you need to consider or could possibly be of benefit to you when writing your plans or during during an incident of some sort. He does come from an animal production background, and he is also the what's called Emergency Support Function 11 Coordinator for New Mexico. And I'm sure he will explain to you what that means. So I'm going to go ahead now and turn that over to Marshall. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yvonne, and thank you for the opportunity to address the issue of emergency planning and preparedness and response. I think it's a really important issue that sometimes gets kind of pushed to the back burner with everyday operations, and is certainly something that, you know, when a real emergency happens, we see the benefit of the emergency planning. When I was asked to kind of talk about some of the issues we're looking at and what we would like zoos and aquariums to know from a state perspective, I really kind of boiled down it into 3 or 4 topics, and I'll go over these topics. But as I'm going through, instead of a presentation style, I really like the discussion style where it's a little more interactive. So as I'm going through these, if anybody has any questions, again, please feel free to use the chat or just ask me, and we can have a discussion about it. I know there will be breakout groups later, and where we can go into a little bit of a deeper dive, but that's kind of the way I like to give presentations. And so when we're thinking about why make an emergency response or contingency plan, it's not just some document that we need to check the box for some regulation reason. The justification for those is to protect human life as well as animal life and any property that's associated with a business. And so when we get into these things, it's really important to think about what might happen, and that's going to be different for each and every jurisdiction, especially when we're talking about the different jurisdictions, whether it's in a state, a county level, or part of the two, thinking about what might happen within that jurisdiction, whether it might be a natural hazard, say floods or fires, or more centered around urban interface dealing with people, or disease-related events. And whenever you're going through that process, it's really important to reach out to stakeholders that are outside of your organizations that have kind of the outside looking in perspective to be able to say, hey, when we were doing this, we came across this issue, and you guys might consider that as well. And so that's usually the first step to an emergency plan. And following that, you get into writing your contingency plans. And some of the things we've seen with other operations, specifically in the agricultural sector, is you need to look at what is necessary to continue operations for your business. And what we mean by that is cover the basics. And typically in agriculture, that means things like feed, water, transportation, and evacuation in case of emergency. And sometimes what we see folks doing, and they're really getting into this and well-intentioned, but they start developing what we call Murphy's Law's plans. And so if you know the old adage, it's that anything that can go wrong will go wrong. And we really encourage people to try and kind of avoid that. While it's important to think about all the things that go wrong when developing an emergency management plan. It's really important that it's quick, easy, and accessible for people to get into and find out what they need to know. And so if you're developing a plan that's 50 pages long, then whenever things really begin to happen, people aren't going to wade through an emergency plan and try to find the answers they need. And so on the other side, flip side of that, though, you need to be specific enough to where people can quickly reference the plan, find out the steps that are needed to take, and take the appropriate steps. And so in order to do some of these things, it's really, really important to know, as Yvonne said, what are your resources? Who are the folks that you need to get in contact with? In some places, we call them subject matter experts. Some places just call them professionals. But these are the folks that will have the specific expertise to be able to help with any kind of emergency. Primarily, the number one person that needs to be in contact with a zoo, aquarium, or other business is the emergency planner and emergency management person at the most local level, and typically that's at your county level. Other additions include, I'll take Dr. Mundschenk as an example. If I have an animal health issue, then although I have an animal health background and I know what I'm doing in my day-to-day operations, he's the person that's going to be the subject matter expert and that I'm going to need to contact within the plan. And so whenever you're making these plans, it's also really important to make those contact lists of the subject matter experts, whether they be the local, state, or federal level, and continuously update. And I'll talk about a little bit more about that later on. In addition to that, knowing what people are out there, knowing what other resources are out there are important as well. And so what kind of other jurisdictions might have resources that can be used in the event of an emergency. And here we'll talk a little bit about mutual aid agreements, or MOUs. And so, and this is where I really appreciate partnerships like this that gives people the opportunity to come together, discuss what might be happening within their jurisdictions, what they're experiencing with the different issues, and what kind of resources they have to be able to respond. And so this can operate both ways. Maybe you're looking at your emergency operations plan or contingency plan, whichever language you prefer to use, and you identify that you might need to eventually evacuate during a situation. Number one is, do you have a place to evacuate to? And number two, do you know the appropriate routes and transportation assets that are going to help you evacuate? And so that's where these mutual aid agreements come in, and being able to already have those agreements in place prior to the emergency becomes incredibly effective at being able to move in an effective manner, an efficient manner during an emergency. And so in addition to that, it's familiarity with just the overall emergency management process and thinking about the terms that people use. I know sometimes whenever we get into talking about specific agencies or industries, we get a lot of acronyms thrown around in what's known as the alphabet soup. And so what we've found within the Department of Agriculture here in New Mexico is that it's really important to bring people in at the ground level and we mandate that all of our oncoming employees take the basic courses within the ICS system. That's the Incident Command System, which kind of covers the overall response to an emergency. And so we have those people take those trainings at the most basic level, and then in leadership positions, we encourage additional trainings in responding to incidents, and then specific positions within the Incident Command System as well. And so that kind of brings us to another point, is that after you make your plan, train to the plan. And whenever you're planning, the ultimate intent is not just to develop a document that will go up on the shelf and collect dust, and you think, well, we'll get it out when we need it. Training to the plan helps you identify where your vulnerabilities are within the plan, make sure that your people are up to date on all the latest standard operating procedures, and then make plans to make the plan better going forward. And most entities will approach this on a year-by-year basis. And this is where you kind of get into what we call in our type of work the emergency planning process, or the planning cycle. And that's planning, training, equipment, or planning, organizing, training, equipping, and then doing that all over again after an assessment and review period. And so, and this is where, you'll take the opportunity to go in and update your emergency contacts, update contacts even within your own entity because of employee turnover. Make sure that those annual trainings are taken care of, and the communications and credentialing as well. And when we're talking about credentialing, this is another really kind of poignant aspect when we see entities facing an emergency that don't really have an emergency plan in place. Sometimes, say, for example, a fire breaks out and there's a call put out over social media for folks to come and help respond. And sometimes, while that can be a good thing, that can also lead to instances where responding to an emergency can then create a different emergency due to the lack of people knowing what they're doing, having the proper personal protective equipment, or even just training to be able to respond to that incident. And so when we get into those types of things, we really encourage folks to reach out to the different groups within their states or counties, municipalities, what have you, that are the disaster recovery teams. For example, we have in New Mexico what we call DART, a disaster animal response team, but they're not going to know what you guys know. And that's a really important point that I found out whenever I started working, is that most folks have no idea what you do. Even the folks in the typical emergency response realms, the first responders, the police and the medics, they're not going to have any idea what to do whenever they might be rolling up on an emergency at your premises. And so that's where we really encourage you not only to plan with those type of entities, but to train with them as well. And it's said that the entities that plan and train together respond together. And that type of response is what really drives success within your plan. And so to that, and I don't know if you can see this or not, but here in New Mexico, we, through our Cooperative Extension Service, we commonly put on what we call large animal emergency rescue trainings. And this is where we'll come together with county emergency managers, county extension agents, and subject matter experts, and put on these trainings to where we might teach fire departments how to respond to animals who are maybe stuck in an arroyo or in a cattle guard or something, and kind of go over some of the basic aspects of the animal handling that would be important for our first responders to know. And I imagine that would be all the more important in the exotics industry, where you have animals that have very specific requirements in terms of handling and feeding and just animal care, that kind of having at least the top level of knowledge to be able to, one, initially respond, and then two, identify the subject matter experts that can provide some additional just-in-time training opportunities for folks to know what they need to do to be able to go out and get the job done. And then, preparedness is a process. So as I mentioned before, it's not really just to check the box, make sure we get the plan done and on the books. I saw, for instance, an earlier federal notice that APHIS is now requiring contingency plans for facilities regulated under the Animal Welfare Act. And so, and what we see a lot of times is they're required to do that, so they do it. And it's not always a plan that really addresses or identifies the types of situations or personnel needs or equipment needs that facilities might need to have access to during an emergency. And so it's a process, as I mentioned before. You go to the needs assessment, the risk assessment phase, the planning phase, the organize phase, the equip phase, the train phase, and then you start that entire phase all over again. But what we've also found out as a result of the process is that there's kind of an unspoken rule within emergency management, is that one, you develop the plan, you implement the plan, you expect the plan to go off the rails, and then you throw away the plan. And I know that's kind of a tongue-in-cheek way of saying it, but what we've learned from the actual preparedness process is that it's not always so much about the plan, but it's about the relationships and the people you meet during the planning process that will really drive the response to an emergency. And so with that, it's just knowing your resources. And as Yvonne said earlier, this partnership is a primary example of a resource that folks can reach out to in order to get the planning process started, or maybe they just have some questions about some very specific aspects of the plan that they need to go over. And I'll offer up an example of another partnership that we have within our state, and it's called the ESF11 Group. So ESF11 is short for Emergency Support Function number 11, which is agriculture and natural resource. Emergency support functions typically respond to an emergency operations center during an emergency event, and we are the subject matter experts for our particular resource. So, like I said, for us, we're the subject matter resources for agriculture and natural resource. Another example is ESF1, which would be transportation, are the folks that have the expertise regarding all types of transportation assets, rules, and regulations. And so what we do within our ESF11 group is we have quarterly meetings usually where we bring together a coalition of all sorts of folks that are within our sector. And that means not only our state New Mexico Department of Agriculture, but we also have our New Mexico State University Extension folks. We go out and we identify folks within the sector. We have New Mexico Cattle Growers, New Mexico Farm and Livestock Bureau. Those types of coalitions are exceptionally important when you're responding to emergency, because they are the folks that are able to respond and think outside of the box. And I'll give just a real brief example of the type of benefits those partnerships can have is during the initial phases of the response to COVID-19. And I'm sure many of you will remember the headlines of empty store shelves and the lack of food, especially in rural areas. Our Emergency Operations Center tasked our ESF number 11 and ESF number 6, which is mass services, with finding out a way to get food distributed to the more rural areas. And what we ended up doing is going directly to our farmers and ranchers and saying, what can you guys do? And overnight, we had an immediate response of trucks being loaded, food being prepared, and sent to the areas of needing it, that needed it. And that was driven from a real grassroots level that we said, here's our problem. What do you guys have? And they were able to come back to us and said, this is what we can do. We can do it tonight. And we got the ball rolling with that. And so I've kind of thrown a lot of things out there in a real quick way. And I know it's a lot to take in, but the overall message that I want to leave is that planning is an incredibly important process, and people you identify and get to know within the planning process are going to be the folks that really drive the success or failure of response to a plan. And so with that, Yvonne, Sharon, I hope I was able to offer some important information, and I guess I'll kind of stand for questions if there are any.
Yes, great, Marshall. Thank you so much. I have a quick question for you that maybe you can address, and then I'm going to call on Dr. Mundschenk if he wants to add anything additionally from his subject matter expertise. What are some of the biggest hazards or vulnerabilities that you see and have identified in that Southwest region of the United States? We hear about hurricanes and the Gulf and tornadoes in the Midwest. Can you talk a little bit about some of the hazards and the vulnerabilities that you see in animal populations in the Southwest?
Sure. So one of the most common hazards we see within the Southwest is fire. And it can take either the form of wildfire or even fire within urban centers that probably has the most potential and the most occurrence within the state. And of course, there are the driving factors to those fires that we need to consider as well. Most people don't consider drought a hazard that bears emergency response planning. But whenever you consider these things, you need to consider things like reductions in water availability, or even the possibility of flash floods after an extended drought might break when we get a lot of rainfall, for example. So those are a few of the natural ones. And then on the other side, of course, we are always concerned about the possible introduction of foreign animal diseases, especially with our relationship right here on the southern border, and some of the threats that we see that from immigration and even everyday trade and transportation across the border, the possibility of introducing some of those disease aspects.
That's really a good point. I mean, a lot of what I've done with the ZAHP partnership is focus on disease, and it's, we think in an all hazards perspective, but that's where, obviously the state animal health officials are, absolutely the gatekeepers of all knowledge about how, the state plans to respond to those incidents. And I guess I'll maybe ask Dr. Mundschenk while he's here. Currently, do you have, other than your regular state planning guidance, do you have anything in particular in your foreign animal disease plans that address like exotic animals or non-domestic species, or are they sort of generically included in your state planning efforts?
Currently, they're generically included, but we're looking at kind of separating those out for a variety of reasons. One is that the zoos, we would be trying to figure out if we did a vaccine protocol for like FMD or something, how we would do those with the zoos. I think COVID's kind of brought that to the attention a little bit here this year, especially with the zoos and COVID getting into some of the large cats and other species. So they're looking at trying to start that vaccination at a couple of our zoos with the COVID vaccine. So again, how do you get the vaccine into the animals? That becomes another whole issue unto itself. Apparently, training the animals to take a COVID vaccine wasn't what they were planning for, I don't think. I don't think there was a plan in there to vaccinate tigers and lions. Oh my.
No, that's very true. They do get vaccines, but I think that, this is really unprecedented times. And, I will tell you that, pre-COVID, because I know you were at one of our meetings that we had in Albuquerque, and when you're talking with people about foreign animal diseases, you say, well, if foot and mouth disease affected your facility, you might be closed for 6 months. And people look at you like, there's no way we'd be closed for that long. Well, look at how long some of the zoos were closed because of COVID. So it definitely does happen. Marshall, do you have anything in particular about exotics in your disease planning efforts?
Not particular about exotics. We're similar to Arizona, is that we kind of generically include them, but that's a really good point. Is we address the domestic animals, we address to some degree wildlife species, but exotics are one of the aspects that really needs to be thought out, because they are a very special segment, and they have a lot of different considerations than a normal agricultural operations might have, that might require some additional response.
Excellent. So does anybody else have any questions while we're all together, or do we want to break out into groups a little bit? I guess, Ashley, I'll leave that to you and Haley.
Yeah, we can definitely get that set up with the breakout groups. I wanted to see just if Sharon had anything before we do that as well.
Oh, you're on mute, Sharon, I think.
Okay, I'm sorry. I just wanted to reiterate, or maybe underline or underscore what Marshall was saying about planning and communication and contacts and MOUs, and any of those aspects always need to be reviewed, as he said, and even annually. Sometimes, people change jobs. We've seen a lot of people leaving positions of authority, or new people coming in, and the documents aren't signed and aren't prepared. So just as you're going through your plan process, make sure you include in there some sort of review or annual review or update system for that, because it's only as good as it is. But that was one thing that occurred to me. So.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. And Dr. Mundschenk, is there anything else that you'd like to add before we split up into breakout rooms?
No, I think Marshall pretty much covered all the hazards here in the Southwest, as far as, even the border and potential things that could come across the border, especially with people coming across illegally. Lord knows what they bring. And then talking to our Border Patrol people, seems like the cartel these days are making more money on importing illegal people, and they seem to charge a lot more for non-nationals. So, which basically means that there's people coming in from South America, China, and other points around the world that have a lot of these other diseases like African swine fever, FMD, and things like that. So, that's probably one of our biggest threats. And New Mexico and Arizona are kind of the key spots, I guess, so to speak, where this is happening right now. So
Yep,
something to always keep us on alert.
absolutely.
One other hazard that I think is going to be a lessons learned from COVID is part of the cascading events. So things that might not have been part of the initial emergency, but are resulting of the consequences of the emergency. And one real life example of that is such as the food shortage that was a result of the many aspects of COVID, where there was be increased demand or bottlenecks within the transportation sector. And that's something that I think is not commonly addressed within some plans, and folks will consider what to do in the event of a natural hazard, with the assumption that the natural hazard will be over within a week or maybe 2 weeks, and not prepared to deal with the longstanding consequences of an event in identifying alternatives for feed, water, their everyday use necessities.
I think that's a really good point, because one of the things that I've learned in my 15 years or so of working with this particular sector of animals is that we are by and large pretty good at handling short-term events. We're pretty good for, let's recapture that animal. Let's respond to a severe thunderstorm issue coming through, that sort of thing. But it's these long operational periods with these real, you know, impactful hazards that happen, we can all use to step up our game. And I think, you know, we've always tried to advocate, how can you be as prepared as possible for 72 hours? You know, while whether it's a disease event or a natural disaster of some sort, that how self-sufficient can you be for 72 hours? That's what the government challenges us to do. I mean, I would hope that that's a bare minimum of what our plans help to address, because we know it can go much longer than that. But it's all about lessons learned and improving. So.
Hi, I was just going to comment on that, if you don't mind. My role is Director of Nutrition for the San Diego Zoo and Safari Park. And that's been foremost in our minds, obviously. And so what was really reassuring initially was reaching out to our vendors, who were all able to say, it's fine, we're considered essential, we continue to work. Of course, that was last February. And what we're seeing now is a series of issues that are cumulative, I think, and some of them are related to actual raw materials, and some of them are some of the things that Marshall and others have mentioned, which are transportation. The product is made halfway across the country. Getting it here is, you know, the drivers aren't available. There's staffing issues. People can't recruit, or they can't get the parts to repair. I've heard of something crazy like a train sleeper being sort of, or one of those big units, just been out of action for a month because they couldn't get the parts because they come from somewhere else in the world. And so something that we did, and I'm really glad we did right at the beginning, was a risk management table for our vendors and for all the ingredients or feeds, I should say, that we get, not the individual ingredients, but all the different feed items, and then looked at the risk, you know, which animals could go without if that food wasn't available, and how critical would that be? And it's a pretty mammoth task, but it's definitely, it's been advantageous because there's been very random shortages over time that have happened months later. And then being in San Diego, even things like rabbit hemorrhagic disease, you know, there's different things that have impacted us. So it seems like it's COVID and it's disease, and now I'm hearing about the impact of drought and wildfires on haze shortages, potentially in our region, probably in the Pacific Northwest as well. So I'm really glad to hear the discussion about food, because that's kind of why I joined, and I've done the courses. So I've been following the materials from this group for a while now. But yeah, I just think that's such a critical part for longer range planning now.
That's excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that, because, you know, I'm sure there was, you know, everybody's felt the shortage in some way. I know very early on in the discussion, I'm pretty sure Ashley was part of this opportunity. There was a group that sort of came together to start talking about, oh yes, Ashley absolutely was there. Talk about sort of animal management issues earlier in the outbreak. And we started talking about, you know, carcass feeding. And, you know, because we were looking at processing problems in you know, the upper Midwest, and, you know, all the carnivores that rely on food, and you know, talking about the pros and cons, you know, what could be done. I think sometimes people think, that don't work in the zoo world would think, oh my goodness, it would be so easy just to feed a carcass. And you know that it isn't always an easy answer. And I actually had a friend of mine that works in the Department of Agriculture up in Minnesota that said, you know, we've got all these hogs that really have nowhere to go. Would the zoo want hogs? And I'm like, you know, think of all the steps between on the hoof and in the mouth. And well, one of the things, I don't know, do you guys feed any pork? Most zoos don't feed pork.
Right. Exactly.
So you know, it's just understanding those interesting facts that you're not connecting before you have a problem, that I think will be very interesting to maybe do sort of that, you know, that analysis after we're out of this a little bit, and we can look back and see how we can make improvements in those things. So yeah, that's very true. Does anybody else have anything awesome to share like that before we break out into groups?
Two things real quick. One, I just wanted to add, Yvonne, regarding that feeding group. We did also hear from a couple of places that were offered just large amounts of poultry, and sort of a variety of how that went. Almost always it was an amount that was not something that the zoological facilities could take in or accommodate, or they didn't have the capacity to butcher that on site. But some of the discussions that took place, I know of at least one area where they were able to make some agreements where one zoological facility said, okay, we'll take this in and the others will come meet us and we'll distribute it out that way. But that's another area where kind of making these connections ahead of time can really help better serve the whole community. And another thing, I just want to take a quick vote. We actually have a small number of participants today. And so rather than break out into groups, if everyone would be okay with staying in this main room, we would still stop the recording for the conversation. That said, if you are not comfortable with this, if you can just send me a direct chat, and I will turn it back over to Yvonne and Sharon while we wait to see if anyone has anything to say about that.
I think that's a great idea, Ashley. I think this will be a nice group. You know, we do have some questions that we've kind of prepared that we would love to kind of throw out to folks, and then, you know, see how you answer them. Sharon, do you want to take the lead on that? Because I'd love to take notes here.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Am I on? Ashley, can you hear me? You can hear me. Okay, thank you. I wanted to make one comment, if I could, about hay, because that's a really important component for a lot of reasons. And you may be very familiar with the droughts that occurred on the eastern seaboard in the 2008 to 10. That was the longest deployment I had as the director of a program for food and ag. We couldn't get hay in. And so we had to devise a way to make it available without buying it ourselves. So we came up with a really, we had private industry bringing in money, and then we were able to pay for the transportation, and then the owners of the animals were willing to pay for the hay. It's just that the transportation was so far expensive, so private industry gave a lot of money. That program also was replicated in the Midwest. So I don't know if you've ever had an opportunity to look at any of those documents on how those programs work, but it's just something to think about. We talked a lot, and it was really good conversation about making sure that you know people in advance. I always found in our program that the best thing that we could do was to find out what the risks were from our emergency managers. They vary across the state, and it can be ice, it can be a drought, it can be floods, it can be hurricanes, tornadoes. We kind of have it all. And we don't have the large wildfires, but we have the smaller forest fires. And we had them in 2016, 15 and 16, on top of avian influenza preparations, because we had a huge outbreak. And most people may or may not know that North Carolina has about 860 million birds on the ground every day. They're kind of moving through some part of the process. So it's a lot to think about when you're trying to plan all of those different events. So we had all these things when we had flooding, we had the animal disease issue, and we had the major fires. So being able to know who is the expert in the area, who really has the right skills to bring together these massive teams that are needed to handle all these different parts of the sectors is so important. And this group can offer so much because they were greatly affected by the drought. They've been affected by downbursts and tornadoes in North Carolina. And I don't know about your different areas, but I can imagine there are some similarities. And so knowing these people in advance, making, again, we've already mentioned this, but making sure you've got the right contact. A lot of people move around. You can't blame them to take a new opportunity or to retire. So all of those things are very important. And also, if you use volunteers, sometimes people in a lot of industries, not just the zoological industry, have a volunteers, and they're very well trained. They know exactly what they're doing with the animals, but they may never have had to integrate into an emergency response. So having even your volunteers, if they're not going to be part of that, then have that clearly stated. But if they are, make sure that they have some basic training and communication so that they feel like they're contributing. And sometimes you think, well, I'd rather not bother with that. But if these events get long and drawn out, the volunteers can become super important if it's just running errands, or if it's, going and getting supplies, that are needed at the moment, whatever you can do with them. Some people can come on scene and cook, volunteers can if your staff can't leave. So just a lot of reasons to make sure that you not only use your staff, but if you use volunteers, make sure they're trained as well. Do you want me to kind of rotate back and forth with you, Yvonne, and on these questions?
Yeah, that sounds good. Ashley, do you want to move us to the breakout, or do we just want to stay here and turn off the?
Yeah, we're good. I'm going
Okay.
to turn off the recording. I haven't gotten any comments from anyone, so that's starting now.
Excellent.